on risk and illness and emphasize the individual characteristics of the young person, what they need to change. Holistic practices really focus on wellness, collectivist models, and really culture at the foundation. So connection to culture is critical for identity and thus critical for wellness. Take a transdiagnostic approach. So Dr. Ungar, I think, gave you a list of all the different diagnoses that young people come in with. And First Nations would like us to not give the laundry list, but to look at what are the underlying mechanisms under almost all of those diagnoses. And for them, it's trauma. Trauma explains almost everything in the young people that we see. It explains their internalizing symptoms, depression, anxiety. It explains the externalizing symptoms, and it can explain substance use. And it provides us with an idea about how to move forward for these young people. Instead of treating 10 different disorders, you're treating the underlying mechanism. Trauma-informed is another theme. Of course, this is a mainstream word for what they were sharing with us. But really, the primary objective is to promote psychological and physical safety for young people, not only in the world, but also in the work that we do. So when we have young people come in for an assessment, we want them to feel safe. We want them to know what the expectations are, what it's going to look like, help design what they want us to know about them, as well as their wellness plan in the end. And have a voice in that and choice. So if they don't want to answer questions, they can pass. And you'll see that in the end when I talk a little bit about the youth voice. And the focus on wellness is really looking at, as the earlier presenters talked about, purpose, hope, meaning, and belonging, balancing one's spirit, emotion, mind, and mental aspects. And the final piece that we don't typically do in assessments is you have one person who lays out the assessment plan, and this is how the recommendations are going to be. But the young people and the communities really wanted us to be included in the process. So for most of our assessments, we're moving now towards a circle process. So in the end, once we have some data collected on the young person, we have gone to the nation, and with the young person's permission, of course, and engaged with the band representatives and various other parties and the young person and their parents to talk about who is going to play a role in moving this young person forward in their healing. And it's amazing, I talked a little bit about barriers at the beginning, alternatives to incarceration. There are many alternatives that the mainstream just doesn't have in their mind. And once you go to the nation and ask them what the alternatives might be, you get all these wonderfully creative ideas and people who are going to wrap around these kids and keep them safe. So what was the outcome of all this work? One is to produce a living document, which is accumulation of all the shared information. So we are working on that document now, and I call it a living document because we interviewed the First Nations in our local community, but of course, each culture is different, and there's over 600 different First Nations in Canada, and they each have their own culture and their own traditions. So our document is living in the sense that there's underlying principles that can be adapted depending on the culture. We're looking for improved assessment practices and to be culturally responsive, and I gave an example of that earlier. And obviously our long-term vision in a lot of the work we do is to reduce the disproportionate outcomes. So I'll leave you with the voice of youth. One is that they want space to talk about their problems, but they also want to talk about what they're proud of. They want to leave each session, each point with us with a high spirit. They want the right to pass. They don't want to be forced to answer questions all the time. They want to build a larger community. Wi-Fi is a basic need. And YouTube is healing. And I think this speaks to Dr. Weckerly's talk as well. I mean, I think a lot of these kids are very isolated, and YouTube is and other, Wi-Fi, social networking is really the only way they can connect with their culture and with other youth who are in their culture. And then finally, let us share in different ways. So writing, drawing, song lyrics. So we've incorporated those into our Section 34 assessments, song lyrics at times. One youth conceptualized their life as a book with chapters, so we wrote the assessment like a novel with chapters. I think in that particular case, the judge really appreciated hearing the voice of the child. Thank you.
Thank you very much. When we planned this out, we had chatted about whether or not it would be a good idea to just kind of, you'd asked if I would just reflect very quickly on some of the core principles, since I spent a lot of time thinking about this stuff. It's a great list of, great set of programs. So here's the way I was thinking about this. One, I'm sure if we selected 4 more people from the audience, we could also gather an amazing another 4 examples of interventions that are actually working or that have the potential to be embellished and scaled up. And that's what I keep learning about in my travels. What I am cognizant of is how often we don't do that. We don't do enough appreciative inquiry. I'm not sure how often you as staff teams sit around and actually talk about, well, actually something went right today, or this is the kind of program that's actually having a change. And I encourage you, next time you're kind of depressed by the weightiness of endless case conferences that focus on the negative, perhaps to see if you can't also carve out some time to focus on, as we've just seen, saying that there are some things out there that are actually working. The other thing I'd say is it's remarkable when you hear these examples. I mean, I was recently just in Botswana, other side of the world, and I'm looking at a program run by a colleague of mine, a social worker named Dr. Masaigo Katisi. And she intuitively started a program, a national program for HIV/AIDS orphans, which is kind of a misnomer because these kids aren't really orphaned. They're simply, their parents have died, but they're taken up by their communities. And she offers them a rite of passage. She's figured out a model where they're engaged in the community with their social workers, their community workers, and then they all go off to a camp for 2 weeks. The workers travel with the kids rather than shuttling the kids off to sort of special trauma-informed therapists. And then they work together. They spend like 3 years, not at the camp, but 2 weeks there, and then they spend this long period of engagement and time. And honestly, if Masaigo was here with us, she would be resonating with many of the same things that you've just talked about. And if I could bring this around, I mean, when I listen across the panel, I hear respect for rights. That really tuning in, whether I love it, why is it right? Yes. But this notion of empowerment, respect for rights, the legislation, all the treaties, and everything else that we're talking about here, and the conventions that respect children. When our programs reflect those, they are better programs. I also heard a saying that almost every single program had some element of making services accessible, whether that's an app, quick access was the Joyce you were saying. Whether we're talking about providing language in a way, helping someone engage in programming through the language that it's provided in, or making it accessible because it's designed as a game, which tends to attract young males into mental health like approaches. So, third thing I hear is, it's interesting, programs seem to do better when they're more complex as opposed to simple. What I heard almost every single model here talk about that the services have to be thinking in integrated ways. Christine, you were mentioning, right at the top button, if you're needing something, you're able to link right away to another service. Almost every service talked about that there are many services that are linked into the program, rather than just this kind of notion that we're going to just, honestly, if you're sending somebody off for one-shot treatment with one service, you might as well admit you're wasting your money. It doesn't work, and none of these would support that sort of very narrow focus on an individual. You also seem to all mention relationships or modeling, to talk about modeling of how to behave, how to not behave, but how to sort of navigate, how to find resources. Each of your programs seems to put children with someone who can actually help them, model for them, build bridges for them. It was kind of funny listening about routines and structures and safety, calendars, journals, dailies, coming back to Christine's point, but almost in every case, something about the routine of it, the consistency of it, again, getting away from those one-off efforts. Another point, sensitivity to the children's context, culture, thinking in trauma-informed terms, in terms of not, understanding what might trigger the child, what's causing the trauma, what's happened in the child's past. And again, I'm amazed by sometimes, the very best programs always seem to do that. They appreciate why that child is going to do what they're going to do and adapts the program to the child as opposed to expecting the child to adapt to the program. Interesting too, multiple pathways. Different folks talked about group therapy, individual treatment, group treatment, and indeed community engagement as the wraparound to get them. And again, it's very interesting that we'll send off a kid and we'll say, well, we have available, it's like, I always think about like a box of Smarties. And you throw it out to the community, and if you happen to be lucky and the kid says, well, I got the purple Smartie and I actually like purple Smarties, then that's the service they get. As opposed to, of course, thinking, well, actually, what service would you like? And maybe it's a green Smartie, and that's a problem, because green Smarties are only offered in Ottawa, and you're down in London, so you have, like, how do you get the green Smartie? Do that. So it's very much that kind of thing of seeing multiple pathways. And if I might just a last point, multiple knowledge systems. Whether that's getting youth voices, or Indigenous voices, or to contrast that and work together on the double path, sort of the two-eyed seeing kind of approach, where you bring in sort of Western empiricism and Indigenous knowledge basis ideas. Youth, professionals, all those types of dichotomies seem to inform better interventions. And it's remarkable that, I know you didn't rehearse this, but I'm always amazed by, when I listen to this, I get the privilege of hearing a lot of these kinds of programs presented, and I'm always absolutely amazed by how common these elements are. And indeed, if I was to introduce you to Ms. Sago from Botswana, I'm sure that she would resonate with each of those various same points as well. So, to start this, that's my part. I want to just kind of throw this back at all of you. Do you see overlaps? What do you sense as overlaps in your program as a way of informing best practices for the audience to say, if you're going to go forward or you're going to refer a child to a program, you better tick these boxes, or else the program probably, to be fair, is probably not working very well. Do you have a sense of what overlaps you just heard? What jumped out? Anyone? I mean, yeah, we put up a whole bunch of microphones here.
I think
they're all on, yeah.
I think one thing that permeates all of our discussions is really engagement with youth and trying to see their point of view and getting their opinion and getting their input on how we do our work. So allowing them to come to us, asking, being curious, asking them all the questions so that we can do our work better, I think is really at the foundation instead of it being top down.
I think that that idea that comes from the Indigenous tradition of co-creation, which is what we're talking about, that we have co-creation between, what we don't throw all the research out that's been done to date and has cost $1 bajillion. We bring that forward and say, what does the research tells us our best bets? And then, when we talk to youth, we can reflect back, these are some best bets. Does any of this make sense to you? And then to have input from the people who are supporting youth, whether that's community or other professionals, to also, because they have their own knowledge set. So thinking of it as a kind of a pie of knowledge set that you really want to bring together to bear on the outcome. And to think of these things as not distinct. So while you may have a program for Indigenous youth and you want to be creative, you may think of, well, or in a mental health and DBT type approach, there will be a wait list. So maybe instead of just having an app that would help them during the waitlist period, might be a thought where you can provide more kind of continuity of support and preparing the ground for services.
Yeah, sure. I just, to highlight the complexities of young people's lives, I think is really key across all the projects that have been talked talked about here today. Just, as you said, to focus in on one aspect of a young person's life is never going to resolve where a young person is at. But to think holistically when we're dealing with young people, I think it's a common thread. Whether that's culture and their history, or whether that's with regards to their own individual challenges that might be related to learning issues, etc. So the complexities of young people's lives need to be part of programs.
Yeah, no, I'll go. Okay. Kind of stemming from what everyone said, especially with Kim, is just being like flexible and being able to adapt the programs that we have. So changing the way that we do a Section 34 assessment to be something that resonates with the youth, like chapters. Or Christine was talking about with the app, surveys before me, when they present where they're rating, and it might end up being more upsetting to them. So adapting the way that you do that, or adapting the services through service coordination. Or with DBT, we've adapted that as well in some other DBT programs. I'll have a parent component, but recognizing that some of the youth, or many of the youth that we see coming through child welfare, that's not appropriate. So also being flexible and adapting existing strategies and programs to fit who we're serving.
Okay, so if this is working a little bit, let me turn the heat up a little bit, or just make this a little more difficult. What I often get challenged by is when you give people examples like these, I often get, eventually people say, like, okay, how did you convince your systems to